I'm John Geoghegan, and welcome to the talk today on the Ghost Blimp, the enduring mystery of the L8. How many of you are familiar with the L8 story? I'm just curious. Okay, we've got a couple. Well, hopefully, I think I'm going to be able to tell you some stuff today that you don't know. So my talk this morning is based on research for my book, When Giants Ruled the Sky, the brief reign and tragic demise of the American rigid airship, which tells the true but little known story of the U.S. Navy's airship program during the 1920s and 30s. It played an important part in Bay Area history, as you'll soon find out. And it was research for my book that actually led to my writing this article for Aviation History magazine about the Ghost Blimp, which I think you'll see obsessed with. Once I heard the initial facts, I did a lot of deep research into the story, which I'm going to share with you today. So as you may know, the Ghost Blimp, which was designated the L8 or the Love 8 in military parlance, was based here on Treasure Island during World War II. Treasure Island and Moffett Field down in Moffett in Mountain View served as very important U.S. Navy airship bases during the war. This was necessary because immediately following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, 11 Japanese E-boat submarines were redeployed from around Oahu to the California coast, where they operated for some months with impunity, sinking merchant vessels right and left. A lot of people that grow up in California don't realize that the California coast was actually lousy with Japanese submarines during the first year of the war, but it was. And so it was necessary to use blimps on anti-sub patrol to try to spot these Japanese submarines. In fact, America had been at war only a few months, but the Japanese E-boats had already sunk more than a dozen U.S. ships off the West Coast. Here's a photograph of one, the Crescent. This is a General Petroleum tanker, the Emilio, which was sunk, or I should say targeted, attacked by a Japanese submarine. And the crew abandoned ship, and the Emilio actually washed up, I think, at Crescent City, California. There's a plaque there today commemorating that event. And in fact, one submarine, the E-17, shelled California's largest oil storage facility just north of Santa Barbara in February, I believe, 1942, which was the first time a foreign enemy had attacked the mainland United States since the British bombed New Orleans in the War of 1812. So, and as part of my book, I actually interviewed the first officer of the Japanese submarine, the E-17, who led the artillery attack on the Goleta oil fields. That was an amazing story to hear him recount. So, just for some perspective, this is a Japanese postcard from 1942 commemorating the event of the E-17's attack on Goleta, north of Santa Barbara. Okay, so blimps were perfect for anti-submarine patrols because they were slow-moving, they could hover above the water, and they could easily spot a sub that was located just beneath the surface. And they were also useful as convoy escorts, again, to protect against submarine attacks. In other words, the Navy had a huge demand at the beginning of the war for K-class blimps to defend against the Japanese submarines on the West Coast and the German U-boats on the East Coast. And in this picture, you can actually see numerous control cars being assembled for these blimps that were to be used for an anti-submarine patrol. Now, many of these blimps were actually built by Goodyear, which had a lot of experience building blimps in general, not just for their advertising fleet, but for the U.S. Navy prior to World War II. Now, Airship Patrol Squadron number 32 was the first blimp unit established on the West Coast after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, and the L8 was part of this unit. Now, the Love 8 was about 150 feet long, which is about half as long as a football field, had a maximum diameter of about 47 feet, and she was kept aloft in the air by 123,000 cubic feet of helium, the same gas that you find today in a party balloon. She was also powered by twin 145 horsepower engines, and she had a cruising speed of roughly 50 miles per hour. So those are all the technical specs for the L8, for the rivet counters in the audience who really care about those details. Her operational ceiling was about 5,000 feet. In case you didn't know it, blimps are generally low altitude aircraft. They don't exceed 5,000 feet in height, which makes them excellent for spotting submarines, whether the subs are on the surface or just beneath the surface. Now, the L8 was originally part of Goodyear's advertising fleet. Before World War II, it was flying around the country advertising Goodyear tires. But the Navy purchased her and shipped her to Moffett Field for assembly, and then commissioned her on March 5th, 1942. She carried a crew of 2 pilots, a pilot and a co-pilot, basically, and was equipped with 2 depth charges that were mounted on an external rack outside the control car, as well as a 30 caliber machine gun and 300 rounds of ammunition. Her mission? To locate and sink any Japanese sub spotted off the coast of San Francisco. And believe me, there were plenty of Japanese subs off the coast of San Francisco. So this is a diagram of your typical blimp. This is the outer envelope. You'll see in the center, there's a gas cell that's filled with helium. You usually have a ballonet, which is air pressure in the forward and in the stern. And the reason why these ballonets are important is because the higher you fly in the air, the higher altitude you get in a blimp, the more your helium expands. And if you begin to descend, then the air pressure contracts your helium. So you need to have these air ballonets to kind of balance out the pressure so that the envelope stays in basically in an oval circle, that it doesn't begin to sag in the middle. And then, of course, you have the control car underneath with the engines, in this case, twin engines on either side of it and a little wheel for landing. So the most important thing is, if you fly higher than 5,000 feet in a blimp, the helium inside is going to expand so much, it's going to blow your gas cells and you're going to crash. So that's why these were low-flying aircraft, as they wanted to keep the helium at a certain amount of density. They didn't want to get too high, have the helium expand, and then have the gas cell explode. And the other thing to keep in mind about these blimps is that the helium is also affected by such things as air temperature and humidity, because all those things will impact the density of the helium that's inside. So you could have a warm, sunny day on your envelope of your aircraft, and that's going to cause your helium to expand, for the aircraft to get lighter, and for it to rise. Or you could run into a cloud, and all of a sudden the outside of the envelope cools, which makes your helium contract, which makes the blimp heavier, and causing it to descend. Now, that is probably more than you want to know about the aerodynamics of a blimp, but that's how they basically work. Okay, so blimps were omnipresent in the Bay Area during World War II, and they were constantly patrolling up and down the West Coast looking for Japanese submarines. In fact, I've heard many stories from people who grew up in San Francisco, particularly out in the Sunset District and the Richmond District, during the war, who remember as kids seeing these blimps going up and down the coastline. Now, what's interesting about the L8 is that it already had a storied history before it vanished. In April 1942, just 1 month after she was commissioned, she delivered 300 pounds of spare airplane parts to the USS Hornet at sea. Now, the spare parts were actually meant for Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 Mitchell bombers, which were planning to bomb Tokyo in retaliation for Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. You can see in this photograph, there is the box of spare parts dangling on a long cable from the control car of the L8. And here is the L8 actually delivering those spare parts onto the flight deck of the USS Hornet. And where that yellow arrow is, you can see one of Mitchell's B-25 bombers there on the lower left-hand side. So the L8 was the the first time that a blimp had ever been used to deliver military cargo at sea. So it was kind of a first. It was just one example of the innovative use that the US Navy put her airships to. But by August 1942, the L-8 had made about 100 flights, which is a lot for only 5 months in operation. I looked at the maintenance records, and she required no more maintenance than the usual blimp would get, and had been inspected 4 days prior to her final flight, when she was deemed to be in fine working condition. Very important thing to keep in mind. So early the morning of Sunday, August 16th, 1942, the L-8 prepared to take off from Treasure Island to search for enemy submarines. And the L-8, as I said, had a 2-man crew that day. There was Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adams. Cody was the pilot and Adams was the co-pilot. Both were Navy veterans. Both were married and had exemplary service records. But Cody was actually the senior aviator in Airship Patrol Squadron number 32. He was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he had piloted the L-8 when she originally delivered her cargo to the Hornet. So landing cargo from a blimp on the deck of a moving aircraft carrier is a ticklish thing to do, so you can naturally assume that Cody was a skilled airship pilot. He was also promoted shortly after he landed that cargo on the Hornet, in recognition of his accomplishment. And he was generally considered to be a kind of a cool-headed fellow, not one to lose his head under pressure. All these kind of personal characteristics very important for kind of understanding who these men were before they vanished. In fact, Cody's commanding officer considered him, quote, one of the most capable pilots and officers under my command. Nonetheless, Cody was a latecomer to lighter than air flight. He actually hadn't been designated a naval airship aviator until December 1941. Okay, so he was only 27 years old when he arrived at Moffett Field as a lieutenant junior grade. As you can see, he sported a mustache here. He was also considered pretty taciturn by nature. So not a guy that you could easily warm up to, was how he was described. Now, Cody was senior to his co-pilot Adams, even though Adams was 11 years younger and significantly more experienced. So, for example, Cody had 756 hours of blimp flight time compared to his co-pilot Adams, who had more than 2,000 hours. So, right, can you kind of see there's a little bit of an imbalance here? In fact, Adams had 20 years in lighter than air flight, while Cody had less than 2. So there was a difference in their experience levels. Adams was a veteran of the Navy's rigid airship programs. He'd actually served aboard the USS Los Angeles, the USS Akron, and the Macon, which were all famous big rigids operated by the Navy. Now, Adams was about 38 years old compared to Cody, who was 27. So more experience, older. He'd also been decorated by the German government for rescuing the Hindenburg passengers during the 1937 disaster at Lakehurst, New Jersey. So though Adams was more experienced in airships than Cody, he'd only received his commission the day before their August 16th flight. So he was making his first LTA patrol as an officer. So LA flight number 101 was scheduled to fly from Treasure Island to the Farallon Islands, then up to Point Reyes, and then south again to Montero Beach before returning to Treasure Island, which was kind of a typical triangular patrol pattern, anti-sub patrol pattern for the day. Now, the patrol was supposed to take about 4 hours, with Cody and Adams expected to return to Treasure Island sometime between 10 and 10:30 that morning. And it's amazing. You can look out the window and see the very hangar that these guys left from. That's why this is such a treat to be able to actually give this talk, which I've given before, in the location where they took off from. So the L8 lifted off from Treasure Island at 6:30 in the morning on August 16th, 1942, with Cody at the controls. The day was slightly overcast, but visibility was generally good at 3 to 5 miles. Winds were light and variable at 14 knots. And the ceiling was about 800 to 1,000 feet. So kind of ideal, actually, blimp flying conditions, because though their ultimate high altitude was limited to 5,000 feet, they generally flew between 1,000 and 2,000 feet. Bless you. I hope you're not allergic to blimps. Okay. So once Cody passed over the Golden Gate Bridge, he headed southwest toward the Farallon Islands. At 7:38 in that morning, an hour and a half into the patrol, he radioed the L8's position as 4 miles east of the Farallons. And 4 minutes later, he sent a second message, quote, "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." Now, an oil slick on the surface of the ocean can indicate that an enemy submarine is lurking below. So it's not surprising that what the L8 did next was to drop 2 smoke flares to mark the oil slick, and then began searching the area looking for a sub. Now, when the Liberty ship, the Albert Gallatin, spotted the L8 smoke flares in the water, its crew sounded the general alarm because they thought, okay, this means there must be a Japanese sub nearby, and manned its guns. There were also sailors on a nearby fishing trawler that was called the Daisy Gray that worried that they were a little too close to the blimp. They thought the blimp was about to depth charge a Japanese submarine. So they pulled in their nets and tried to hurry away from the blimp. But the L8 didn't drop any depth charges. Instead, they circled the area for more than an hour. Now, the blimp was close enough to the Daisy Gray that the first mate of the fishing trawler could see 2 men in the gondola of the L8. Very important, because there's confirmation that these 2 guys are on board. And although the L8's identification had been removed from its outer envelope, it still had L8 stenciled on the control car. So it was easy to tell that it was the L8 and not some other blimp. And besides, it was very hard to mistake a blimp of the K-class type. They were pretty distinctive. So as both the Daisy Gray crew and the crew of the Albert Gallatin Liberty ship were watching the blimp through the binoculars, they saw it circle about 200 to 300 feet off the water above the ocean. And at one point, the L8 actually dropped to only 30 feet above the waves, as if the crew wanted to take a closer look at something. Shortly after 9 a.m. that morning, the L8 dropped ballast and rose into the sky and headed back towards San Francisco. Now, that's kind of interesting to me, too, because where were they supposed to go next? They were supposed to go up to Point Reyes, but the blimp was spotted as starting to head back to San Francisco, which is interesting. And then what little has been written about this case, nobody really harps on that, but I think that's an important fact right there, that something was off. Okay, so since blimps regularly patrolled the California coast, nobody thought anything was particularly unusual. But that was the last time Cody and Adams were ever seen alive. Now, the L8 had broadcast its last message at 7:42, saying they were going to investigate the oil slick. After that, Wing Control tried establishing radio contact without success. Now, Squadron Headquarters didn't learn that about L8's radio silence until 8:20 that morning. But it wasn't unusual for blimps to lose radio contact with their base. But when the L8 still had not responded to any calls by 8:50 in the morning, they sent 2 float planes out to look for the L8. The next indication of the L8's whereabouts came at 10:49 a.m. when the pilot, okay, 10:49 a.m., right? That's past the time that she's due to be back at Treasure Island, which was 10:30. So the next indication of the LA's whereabouts came at 10:49 a.m. when the pilot of a Pan American Clipper reported seeing the blimp over the Golden Gate Bridge. Okay, well, that's kind of where you would expect her at that time. He noticed nothing wrong with the airship, which appeared to be under control and heading back to Treasure Island. Then at 11 o'clock, one of the float planes reported seeing the L8 3 miles west of Salada Beach, rising through the overcast at 2,000 feet. Now that's quite odd. That's not where she's supposed to be. A few minutes later, the blimp began to descend and then disappeared in the clouds, and the float plane lost track of her. So nothing indicated that the LA was not in controlled flight at that point, but it was certainly not where she was supposed to be. But 2,000 feet is kind of getting close to the blimp's pressure height. The altitude at which its valves would automatically begin to vent helium to prevent its gas cells from bursting. And normally, as I said, the crewman would have avoided surpassing pressure height. So again, you could consider that not exactly odd, but kind of approaching being odd. Then the next person to sight the L8 was an Army P-38 Lightning, who spotted the blimp near Mile Rock, which is, near the gate. He noticed nothing amiss, assuming it was heading to Treasure Island. Then a few minutes later, Richard Quam, who was an off-duty seaman, was heading for a day at the beach, and he was driving along the coastal highway between San Mateo and San Francisco when he spotted the L8 in the distance, noting that the blimp was sagging in the middle. Now, Quam stopped to snap a photograph, and interestingly enough, the authorities would soon confiscate the photograph. At approximately 11:15, which is 5 hours after the L8 left Treasure Island and 45 minutes after she should have been back at base, the blimp approached Ocean Beach in San Francisco. There was a solitary bather there and noticed that the blimp was hanging just offshore with both its motors silent. So the L8's bad air envelope was sagging noticeably in the middle as it moved broadside to the wind. So, clearly something is wrong. She was only 50 feet above the water. She touched down briefly on the beach, then moved inland until its gondola hit the side of a hill, which packed the starboard engine with dirt and bent its propellers. But the blow knocked one of its depth charges loose, which then fell off the blimp and rolled down onto the beach without igniting. Once the blimp loses a depth charge, I can't remember exactly. A depth charge is those depth charges weigh 325 pounds. That's a significant loss of weight. So what happens if a blimp suddenly loses that much weight? Exactly, it shot up into the sky and cleared the embankment and then disappeared from sight, at least as far as that bather was concerned. Then there were these Sunday morning golfers at the Olympic Club who stopped to watch the blimp limp by them overhead. One club member reported seeing a parachute descend from the L8 while it was still offshore, and he wasn't the only one reporting the crew. Okay, so we have multiple reports that the crew is still on board. And then there was this 17-year-old C.E. Taylor who told the San Francisco Call Bulletin, "I put my binoculars on it and could see figures inside the cabin." It's not unusual, when you get these eyewitness reports that you have conflicting statements. By that time, we now had thousands of people that were watching this derelict blimp slowly float inland. Now, members of the Daly City Fire Department were burning brush on a nearby hill when they spotted the partially deflated blimp, and they soon gave chase, joined by the local police and some good Samaritans, and what one newspaper described as looky-loos, but we would think of today as rubberneckers. Okay, so next the L8 began descending toward Daly City, 2 blocks south of San Francisco's county line. And during that descent, it struck the roof of several homes. In fact, Ethel Appleton heard the blimp's drag line scrape across her rooftop, and then she instinctively grabbed her 8-year-old daughter to protect her. Then Richard Johnston was polishing his car in front of his house, and he noticed the partially deflated blimp overhead, and he rushed to tell his mother, who lived next door. Then at 11:30 a.m., the L8 came to rest in the middle of the 400 block of Bellevue Avenue. This is just another close-up of it being deflated. And here we have it. So the Deputy Marshal Sean Wood of the Daly City's fire department said, "You couldn't have lifted it down any easier than it dropped on Bellevue." That's what he said, a gentle landing, okay? Maybe that's true, but the L8's cabin actually nosed into a utility pole in front of the Johnston home, breaking off the crossarm. And the force of the collision swung the blimp's tail into the electrical wires, sending a shower of sparks to the ground. So, once again, we kind of have these conflicting statements, gentle landing versus, a blimp's tail knocking down the electrical wires and sending out sparks. But fortunately, the L8's fuel supply did not ignite, because that would have been a tragedy, but its envelope was punctured, and the airship slid to the ground, tail first, slowly deflating against Johnston's freshly waxed car. It was a miracle she didn't catch fire when she struck those telephone poles, Morris was quoted as saying. As it was, the L8 dented the hood of the car, sedan, and Bennett's headlight. So there was some damage on the ground, but fortunately nobody was hurt. So Morris rushed to the aid of the blimp's crew as sirens were blaring and the air filled with escaping helium. Actually, there's some reports, you know what happens when you inhale helium, right? You sound like Mickey Mouse. There's some reports of looky-loo bystanders who got too close and, began sounding like Mickey Mouse. I'm not sure if that's true, but I've read those. So firemen immediately surrounded the blimp and they slashed its envelope in an effort to free the crew that they thought might be trapped underneath the envelope. But when firemen peered inside the gondola, they found no trace of either Cody or Adams. As one fireman said, the door was open, but nobody was in the cabin. And you can see in this photograph, there's the L8 marking on the control car, and there's the open door. Daly City fireman Thomas O'Brien noted that the cabin door was latched open, and you can see that here. Here's the door, and it's latched open with the open doorway there. He also noticed that the Bogenhaler microphone, the Bogenhaler is a loudspeaker system that's used to communicate between a blimp and surface ships. That the microphone itself was dangling outside the doorway. So, like on a long telephone cord, kind of hanging outside the doorway. Now, as a precaution, the authorities set up a perimeter around the crash site as firemen lashed the remaining depth charge to the gondola, because this was the other concern, is that we have a live depth charge attached to the side of this, and what happens if it would go off with the crowd so nearby. So later that day, 40 men from NAS Moffett Field and another 50 from a nearby Army post set out to locate the missing depth charge, because they saw, hey, there's only one, where's the other depth charge? They found it and they retrieved it by 3 p.m., but Cody and Adams were still nowhere to be found. Yeah, here's a nice close-up where you can see the door being latched open. Here's the opening of the door. There's the microphone. And, here you can see the one of the engines. There's the wheel, the landing wheel. How 2 naval officers vanished from one of the most heavily trafficked areas between San Francisco and the Farallon Islands, and it is a heavily trafficked seafaring lane. While their blimp was being tracked by ships and airplanes, not to mention people on the ground, is a mystery. Word circulated that actually warm coffee and a half-eaten sandwich had been found in the control car, but that was a rumor. It turned out not to be true. There were a lot of rumors that popped up that later were discounted. But there was a hat belonging to one of the crewmen discovered resting on the flight controls. And the L8's radio was in perfect working order. An inspection soon revealed that all three of the L8's parachutes remained on board. So, report of being somebody jumping out with a parachute, not true. And along with its single life raft, because these blimps, since they traveled across the ocean, had life rafts. Life raft was on board, and so were the three parachutes. Two of the blimp's 5 smoke bombs were missing, which makes perfect sense because those are the two that the crew used to mark the oil slick. And there was a briefcase containing classified material that was found where it was supposed to be, behind the pilot's seat. So further inspection showed the L8's engines to be in perfect working order. The ignition switches were on, and the blimp's instruments and flight controls also operated normally. And there was about 4 hours of fuel remaining in her tanks. So in other words, there was nothing wrong whatsoever with the L8, except that her crew was missing. Now, 2 of the 3 life jackets that were carried on board were missing. But since regulations required Cody and Adams to wear their life jackets while patrolling over water, it's not surprising that the life jackets would disappear along with the men. The only thing slightly amiss was that the blimp's batteries were drained and part of her fuel supply had been dumped. Now, normally a blimp wouldn't dump fuel unless it needed to increase buoyancy in a hurry. But since the L8 didn't seem to have that need, it was unclear why fuel had been lost and her engines idled. So what the Navy did next was they launched an extensive search for the 2 missing men. They had air raid wardens and the San Mateo County Highway Patrolman spent that night combing the area where the L8 had drifted ashore. And for the next 3 days, Navy ships and planes, assisted by the Coast Guard, searched the Pacific. So you can assume it was a very extensive search. But despite calm seas and excellent visibility, there was no sign of Cody or Adams. And the Navy notified both men's wives that they were officially listed as missing. Now, Moffett Field's commanding officer said he was at a complete loss to explain the mystery, and a second Navy spokesman echoed this assessment. Asked whether the enemy could have attacked the L8s, the Navy spokesman responded, "That's very remote," but added, "Nothing the Navy knows now has given a satisfactory explanation of what happened." Okay, so 2 days later, the Navy convened a board of investigation, which I've read. This is actually a copy of the front page of the Navy's Board of Inquiry report. It was a 7-day inquiry, and it took testimony from civilian and naval personnel, eventually establishing that no fire, no submersion, and no misconduct or missiles struck the L8. Okay, this is the Navy's findings. Witnesses from both the Daisy Gray, which was the fishing trawler, and the Albert Gallatin, which was the Liberty ship, testified that during that time they were watching the blimp. Its crew was on board. The engines were running, and they saw no one fall from the cabin. Now, ironically, the Gallatin, the Liberty ship, would be sunk by Japanese subs in 1944. But despite calling 35 witnesses, the Navy inquiry could find no answers to some of the most basic questions. So let's take a quick review of what some of the most basic questions are. Okay, why did Cody and Adams stop broadcasting if their radio was working? What caused the 2 men to leave their airship in mid-flight? And what happened between the time they spotted the oil slick off the Farallon Islands at 7:42 in the morning and the time when the L8 came ashore at Ocean Beach around 11:15, which is a period of about 3 hours and 33 minutes. Now, theories abounded as to why Cody and Adams vanished. So let's review some of the theories. Cody and Adams were captured by a Japanese sub. It was a popular theory during the day. They were spying for Japan and rendezvoused with an E-boat to escape. A stowaway overpowered the two men and somehow vanished with them. You know, what's interesting is there was actually supposed to be a third man on this flight, but they were concerned about the weight, being overweight. And so at the last minute, they said, hey, you can't come on board. It's just going to be us two. More theories. Their disappearance was an AWOL scheme gone awry. Now, absent without leave. That would meant that they wanted to get out of the Navy, and so they arranged for their own disappearance. One crewman murdered the other over a woman, dumped his body, then fell overboard himself. Okay, these are all, I mean, these were all theories back in the day. These were all, you know, theories that the newspapers explored. And okay, so we like that one. It sounds like we like that one. Okay, but don't forget they were both married, right? They're both married. I don't know if they were happily married or not, but they were both married. Okay, a rogue wave swept both men away. The LA temporarily dipped into the ocean, washing both men out of the control cabin. Yeah, yes. I mean, some of these I think are credible theories. All right, one more theory that's still popular today was that they were captured by aliens.
Oh, yeah.
You will still see this theory crop up on a number of websites. Oh, yes, those alien believers are always with us. So most puzzling to investigators was why Cody and Adams failed to broadcast a radio message after sighting the oil slick, right? They said, we're going to go investigate the oil slick, and then they never reported anything else. And if one of them had fallen from the cabin while investigating the oil slick, why didn't the other man radio for help? So if both men were still on board the LA when it headed back to San Francisco around 9 o'clock that morning, what led to their disappearance later? One theory is that the blimp, okay, this is one theory. There's a website out there. This guy is very adamant that he has the correct theory. One theory is that the blimp had been secretly testing experimental radar and that poorly shielded microwaves overpowered the men, causing them to tumble out of the cabin. But there's no hard evidence that the LA was testing experimental equipment on the doomed flight. So I dismiss that as a possibility. Importantly, also, Japanese records indicate that no US Navy personnel were captured off the coast that day. All right, I've been through the Japanese submarine records. I've interviewed Japanese submarine officers from World War II. There was never a hint that a Japanese submarine captured these two guys.
They actually kept records of who they captured?
Well, oh yeah, I mean, they have, are you kidding me? The Japanese are like the Germans. They had detailed records about every patrol that their submarines made. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, they were very, very good at documenting everything. So whatever caused the loss of Cody and Adams probably occurred between their last radio broadcast at 7:42 in the morning and when the Pan Am pilot spotted the blimp above pressure height at 10:20, which is a period of nearly 3 hours. So you see what I'm trying to do is kind of narrow down the window when something happened. So as the Navy's Board of Inquiry concluded, quote, careful analysis of the evidence indicates no reason for voluntary abandonment of the airship. The board therefore believes that abandonment was involuntary. I think that's an important conclusion. I think the simplest explanation is that both men left the airship not long after, okay, this is my theory, is that both men left the airship not long after their last broadcast. I think most likely one fell overboard while surveying the oil slick. That would account for the 2 smoke bombs being dropped, the ship descending to 30 feet, and the use of the Bogue inhaler, which was found dangling from the gondola. So if one guy falls in, the other guy on the control car is going to get the Bogue inhaler out and, you know, shout down to the guy in the water, hey, hold on, I'm going to come get you. I mean, these airships were very susceptible to changes in weight. You know, usually things happen slowly, not rapidly on an airship. So if you lose a depth charge, it's going to rise pretty fast. If you lose a man overboard, not necessarily rise that fast. but could unbalance, make the ship wobbly or the control car itself wobbly. So I don't think they were flying around with the door open. I think, they saw the oil slick. They went down to investigate. They wanted to get a closer look. One of the guys opens the door, latches it, leans out to look closer at this thing, and then somehow loses his balance and falls overboard. The other guy immediately rushes to the door, because he's got to go to the door to get the boat inhaler. He's calling to the guy, and as the airship rises, for whatever reason, it could have been a wind gust or something like that, he too loses his balance and falls out. It's certainly more likely than aliens, abducted by aliens. They didn't have safety. I mean, they had parachutes.
Yes.
And they had life rafts. They had equipment for that, but they didn't strap themselves in. Well, I mean, I think what he did is he went to talk to the guy first, which is when he fell out. But he could have lowered the ship, and I don't know that he would have landed it on the water per se, but maybe he could gotten close enough to the ocean that he could have thrown a line out to the guy and pull him in or something like that.
You had mentioned a hoist mechanism used to lower cargo
Yes.
to the ship. Was that mechanism standard on the blimps?
I don't believe so, no. Yeah, I believe that for the L8, they actually had to install that equipment for the Hornet delivery. I don't know whether that equipment was still on board either in August.
I would say not, John, because they're very sensitive to weight. And when they're weight and fuel conservation, they want
Right.
all the surplus equipment off of that.
Right.
Not needed for the.
Right, they never put anything on board that they didn't absolutely need. But their bodies were never turned up. So, yeah, so let me give you one more thought here, that if you don't think that my theory is a valid theory, I want to show you a picture. This is the interior of the L8 control car. Okay, this is what it actually looks like. And as you can see, it's a very small space with really just enough room for a pilot and a co-pilot. So in other words, it isn't easy to move around inside this, which makes the idea that the two men could have fallen out of the blimp a little bit more credible, I think, when you see actually how confined this is and how easily the gondola could be moved or shaken or which vulnerable to some kind of motion. And I also believe that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. So some of the more complicated explanations, I find harder to believe when, the door latched open, we know they went down to 30 feet, we knew they were investigating an oil slick. It seems more likely to me that they just fell out. Yes, they dropped ballast. Well, that's a good point. That's a hole in my theory, because in order to drop ballast, they would have to have still been on board.
Was there any, did they ever find out what caused the oil slick? I mean, would that
Oh,
provide
no.
any fuel clues at all?
Yeah, no, they never knew. There were often oil slicks, not from Japanese subs, but there were often oil slicks out there.
This one has something to do with it. That looks like an office chair with office chair in it. Yeah.
Right, it looks like a swivel office chair. There's no seatbelts. You're not strapped in. So anyway, after the Navy inquiry was concluded, the L8 was repaired and it was returned to service as a training vessel. Didn't go out on blimp patrols, but it was as a training vessel. Meanwhile, blimps continued to patrol the Bay Area, helping to keep Japanese and German submarines at bay, and even managed to sink one or two of them. I think there's only one case, actually, I think of a blimp. I think a blimp sunk a U-boat off of Florida. But there's one case of it, but they were more of a deterrent than they were as an offensive weapon. The Japanese were worried about being spotted by blimps, so, it kept them under the water or it kept them away. But they weren't really effective offensive weapons in terms of actually sinking a submarine. After the war, the Navy sold the L8 back to Goodyear, which refurbished it, renamed it America, and used it for advertising. The L8 America traveled all around the nation, televising sporting events. And during that time, nobody was ever known to have fallen out of the gondola.
They had the seatbelt.
Oh, yeah. Right. That's why, maybe. In 1982, the L8, or America, was retired by Goodyear, and in 2003, Goodyear donated the L8's control car to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where it was restored to its original configuration and remains on display today. So if you're ever in Pensacola, Florida, you can go visit the L8 gondola. Anyway, the Navy closed the book on this incident, classifying it as, quote, 100% unknown, undetermined. But nevertheless, the mystery of the L8, I think, still fascinates us today. There's numerous websites and YouTube videos dedicated to the incident, and there's even a 1993 episode of the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, focused on the crew's disappearances. But in truth, we'll never probably know what happened to Cody and Adams, since their bodies were never found. In other words, the L8 story contains all the elements of an enduring mystery. The two men simply vanished. Few people realize just how varied and amazing the US Navy's airship program was during the 1920s and 30s and 40s. It was truly amazing. And if you'd like to learn more about it, I encourage you to read my book, When Giants Rule the Sky, which is carried in many libraries or bookstores or online at Amazon. Thank you so much for listening. You've been a great crowd, and I'm happy to answer any more questions you might have.